Good evening. Boy, that really quieted the room down. That's great. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to see you all here this evening. My name is Mary Grant, and I'm the president of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, and I have the distinct privilege of welcoming all of you here for an interesting evening of conversation and discussion under the heading of Can We Save Our Democracy? That's a pretty big topic. So I'd like to come out of here with you all have assignments. We're going to come out of here with some ideas for how we can do that collectively. But before we get into the topic about the book and introduce you to tonight's speakers, I want to just tell you a little bit about the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. Some of you I know are very familiar with it. I recognize some of our 1787 members and our alumni, so welcome to all of you. The Institute was envisioned by the late Senator Edward Kennedy to be a place where we could gather just like this, to have important conversations about democracy, to pull apart the hard issues of the day, and to think about the place that we all play in making a difference. It's also a place where we bring in school groups from across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and beyond. Since we opened our doors a little over 3 years ago, we've had over 60,000 students come through the door and have an opportunity through our simulation educational programs in the Senate chamber to try on the role of what it means to be an elected official, to debate and discuss and to develop legislation in some very thoughtful ways. In fact, I'm thinking some days when I see these young folks in action, we should just pull up a bus, put them all in it, and send them to the nation's capital. That's just a little, so I feel encouraged when I get to see the work that goes on here every day. And when this institute was coming alive, it was because of just thinking about times that were happening, not just the times that we're in, because let's face it, some of the challenges that we're seeing in our present democracy have been in the making for many years to come. They happen to be a little louder now, a little bit more animated. But as you will hear from our authors, these are not necessarily new challenges, but they're ones that we have to pay attention to because there's a lot at stake. So tonight I'm just delighted to welcome to the Institute the authors of the book How Democracies Die, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt are here with us. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about them, as well as our moderator, Heather Cox Richardson. So Stephen Levitsky is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of Government at Harvard University. His research interests include political parties and party building, authoritarianism, and democratization, and as well as looking at weak and informal institutions with a focus on Latin America. He is the author of several books that examine the transition of powers and type of government, and is currently writing a book on the durability of revolutionary regimes. Daniel Ziblatt is a professor of government at Harvard University and a faculty associate at Harvard's Minda de Ginsburg Center for European Studies. Ziblatt's teaching and research is a comparative politics with a focus on democratization, state building, historical political economy, and European politics. He is the author of 2 books, in addition to How Democracy Die, that focus on the creation and structure of governments. In the lead up to the 2016 presidential election, Stephen and Daniel began to see similarities in the changing political landscape and sentiments of the United States and other countries from around the world in our history that have experienced an unwitting demise of their government. They became increasingly alarmed as they witnessed the authoritarian tendencies that emerged during the election, the changing power within the bodies of Congress, and the treatment of the media, and so they joined forces to craft How Democracies Die, a must-read book that offers a disturbing warning about the changing state of America's democracy and a potential roadmap to sustaining it. Stephen and Daniel reading this book was both unsettling and incredibly insightful, and we're honored to have the 2 of you here with us this evening. We look forward to hearing from you. And I'd like to introduce you to tonight's moderator, Heather Cox Richardson. Heather is a professor of history at Boston College and an expert on American political and economic history. She is the author of 5 books on American politics and happens to be working on a book right now, well, not right now, but is in the middle of writing yet another book. She co-hosts the weekly WBUR podcast Freak Out and Carry On with journalist Ron Suskind, and is a national commentator on American political history and the Republican Party. Heather led a thoughtful conversation here at the Institute last fall, and we are so delighted and thrilled to welcome her back here this evening. So let me turn the stage over to our authors and to Heather for a lively discussion and an important conversation. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome to everyone, and thank you for coming out on such a gorgeous night. I suspect you're here for the same reasons that I am, that we don't quite know what's going on. You know, partly, I at least am appalled by what seem to me to be extraordinary inroads on our democracy, the travel ban, the things that ICE is doing, the norms that seem to be crumbling, the fact that every day you wake up and reach for your phone and there's some new disaster. And you're terrified, and then other times you sit there and go, but the courts are stopping the president, and he talks a lot, but nothing ever seems to get done. Maybe I really shouldn't be worried. And the great thing about this wonderful book is that it gives us a roadmap for whether or not we should be worried and what we should maybe be doing more than we are. So let's start right in. I'd like to start by sort of walking us through the book. And maybe starting with you, Daniel, you talk in the book, at the beginning of the book, about how authoritarians rise. Very few people wake up in the morning and say, I've got a great idea, let's put an authoritarian in power. But we seem to get them in different countries at different times. How does that happen?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Well, you know, so in our book, we make the case that democracies die in different ways. I mean, given the title of the book, historically, democracies have died through military coups. During the Cold War, that's how most democracies died. But since the collapse of communism, the way that democracies die predominantly is through elections, through elected leaders coming into office, through constitutional legal means, and then once in office, going after democratic institutions. And so what that means, given that this is the predominant way that democracies die today, we have to really pay very careful attention to the question of how these guys get into office in the first place. And so in the book, we make the case that what often happens, there's often warning signs that there's political leaders, before they come into office, really demonstrate clear violations of democratic norms, or at least indifference to democratic norms. So going after the media, condoning or encouraging violence, not accepting one's political rivals as enemies, and so on. So if you see a candidate who does these kinds of things, and you know, we in the book we discuss Hungary, the contemporary cases of Venezuela, Turkey. These guys go after democratic institutions in their rhetoric. And then what often happens, though, is that political leaders, mainstream political leaders, see these kind of demagogic figures on the horizon and actually think that there might be an opportunity, so embrace them and think that maybe there's a kind of Faustian bargain for them. So mainstream politicians often embrace these guys.
Wait, so you're laying out here that people actually elect these guys,
yes,
even though they have already indicated that they don't believe in democratic norms?
Yeah.
And they make it through the doorway because established politicians say, we don't care that you are sleazy, we want your votes.
Yeah, so, you know, again, yes, that's correct. I mean, so what really happens is that often there's outsiders in a political system who, and if there's a lot of disaffection within a political system, there may be outsiders in the system who make these great promises. And insiders of a political system are very nervous, and so they want to tap into this the popularity. And there's often, again, this Faustian bargain that gets formed. And you know, so we look at historical cases, you know, going back to the 1920s and 1930s to use some kind of very distant cases, but that I think are still instructive. Mussolini came to power through elections, actually. And he was a kind of on the horizon, a popular figure on the far right, and mainstream liberal politicians saw Mussolini on this and were nervous about him, so included him on a party list as a way in an effort to co-opt him. And so there's a kind of either miscalculation, opportunism. Mainstream politicians include these guys, and the Faustian bargain usually backfires, and the populist or the outsider comes into power, and the mainstream politicians are sidelined.
But they've legitimized them by including them in things to try and co-opt them.
Right, exactly. And so, you know, a quote that we have in the book is, again, to use another historical example, when Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor in 1933, a conservative statesman, a kind of mainstream conservative statesman, Franz von Papen, reassured his conservative allies, you know, don't worry about, we're going to appoint Hitler to chancellor. We hate Hitler, we despise him, but we're going to appoint him, and within several months we'll have him so far in a corner he'll squeal. And so this kind of incredible miscalculation where these guys are elevated to power, and then very quickly the Faustian bargain backfires.
You had another great story about Hitler and how he rose. You want to walk us through a little bit more than that?
Yeah, well, so I mean, it really
the beer hall.
Yeah, so you know, again, often the way these guys come to power is they first of all, they show that they're indifferent to democratic norms. So Adolf Hitler in the early 1920s attempted a military coup, the famous beer hall putsch of Munich, and so it clearly was not committed to democratic norms. And then, because it failed, he came back in a second time in the 1920s and decided that he would try to win power through elections. Mainstream conservatives, there was a famous conservative, Alfred Hugenberg, who kind of, again, didn't like Hitler, but decided, well, we'll try to tap into his energy and ally our star with him.
Okay, so winning authoritarian power through elections seems counterintuitive. If, in fact, you have a political system that protects any kind of norms, and that might be a nice time to turn it over to you, how do the gatekeepers fail to keep people like this from gaining power?
Well, gatekeepers, so by gatekeepers we mean mostly mainstream political parties. If authoritarians are going to come to power via elections, political parties who play the primary role in nominating politicians for higher office, they serve as democracy's gatekeepers. We tend to kind of poo-poo parties these days. Parties are not very popular, but they really are historically across region, in my part of the world, in Latin America, in Europe, and historically in the United States, a really critical institution for keeping extremists and demagogues from power.
So when the leaders say we need these guys' the votes that this guy can turn up, they convince the political parties to go along with that, or the political parties for some reason fail. How does that happen?
Well, they can fail in a couple ways. They can fail in the ways that Daniel mentioned, which is to miscalculate, to assume this guy's an outsider, he's ignorant, he doesn't know the ins and outs of politics. Once he has to actually deal with Congress and the media and the courts, of course we, the experts, will be able to contain and control him. As Daniel mentioned, that is often a miscalculation. They often do it out of short-sightedness. They fear the base. They fear losing the next election. They worry about it, but they're really desperate. They're politicians. Their job is to win elections, so they take a risk, and it ends up being very costly. But there are other ways they can fail. In the United States, the major parties, in some ways, reformed their way into failure. So this is not a very popular position, but we argue that one of the reasons why gatekeepers failed in the United States is because with the primary system that we adopted in 1972, gatekeepers effectively ceased to be gatekeepers. Party leaders, for better and worse, no longer have much of a say over who a party's nominee is. Now, that's a more democratic process than we had. It's a more transparent process. It's a more inclusionary process than what we had prior to 1972. But it's also one in which party leaders no longer have the power, the capacity to weed out extremists and demagogues. We saw that in 2016.
Although in 1972, that's how we got George McGovern, and that's why the Democrats put somebody to anchor things a little bit. But just because now everybody's totally depressed, there are a number of cases you both talk about where parties and gatekeepers and leaders have done the opposite. It's possible not to go down this route, and other people have managed not to do that. You want to walk us through that a little?
Yeah, so in the book, looking again at this period of the 1920s and 1930s, which is a dark period in European history, there were a couple of interesting moments where political leaders made the right decisions, and so there's something to be learned from that. So in particular, one interesting case is the experience in Belgium in the 30s. So Belgium's a small country, but there's actually some big lessons to be learned from it. There was a very right-wing party called the Rexist Party, fascist party, run by this guy who wanted to, inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, wanted to have a march on Brussels, and he was really a fascist. And the right wing of the Catholic Party, which was the center-right party, was very tempted to form a coalition with this party, making the same kind of calculation that the Italian liberals had made or the German conservatives had made. The Belgian king, so the fact that he was a king was only relevant because he was a kind of moral authority. He brought the heads of the parties together in a room and said, under no conditions should any of you guys, I mean, this wasn't a command, it was a kind of moral urging to, under no conditions should you form a coalition with this party. And so the parties did not form a coalition with this right-wing party, and they came up with a series of strategies to undermine this far-right party, and this guy was essentially sidelined.
Okay, so here's a great example of another way to do it. But you can see somebody saying, this guy's such a bozo, we don't really have to worry about him. And yet that was one of the shocking things in the middle of the book, is often it's the bozos who end up being authoritarians. Do you want to walk us through how that happens?
Well, it's not. They're not all bozos. Some of them are in fact, at the end of the day, comparing President Trump to other authoritarians.
I didn't use any names at all. And
I'm
actually,
just implying.
I was thinking about
Look,
the
I
guy.
was either go down this track or I was going to say the lesson from Daniel's story is that we need a king. So
But you have a great line.
So-
But you have a great line of some guy in Peru I'd never heard of. And
I'll
you
tell you about that guy in Peru
And you
if you
said
want.
the line.
I didn't
is,
say he was a bozo.
He didn't want to be dictator. He didn't even want to be
Right.
president. And I thought, I'm with him. I like him. But a couple
Okay.
pages
You
later,
wanna
I
hear
was
about
off
Fujimori?
the train. Yeah.
So they're not all bozos. Some of them are dangerously experienced and intelligent. And at the end of the day, we're lucky that we've got a bozo compared to some of these other guys. But Alberto Fujimori is a good case because this is a guy.
This is in Peru.
Peru in 1990 was facing a terrible, terrible crisis. The hyperinflation, a Maoist guerrilla movement. The country's falling apart, and people blame the parties. And so a guy who was basically a math professor, who'd become a rector of a public university, decides he wants to run for Senate. And none of the major parties will nominate him because he's a nobody. So he doesn't have much money, and he's never been elected to anything other than I think like the faculty senate of his university. And he's a total no-name, and decides to run for president in order to gain name recognition for his Senate campaign. And that's why he ran for president. But Peruvians were so, I was going to say pissed off, but we're being filmed, angry, so angry at the established political parties that they voted this guy. He shot up out of the polls out of nowhere, and he's elected president. Now as the campaign heated up, he was actually pitted against the guy who went on to win the Nobel Prize in Literature back when they had a Nobel Prize in Literature, Mario Vargas Llosa, who was a very establishment candidate. The elite all backed him, and so Fujimori, who was of Japanese descent, positioned himself as a real outsider, bashing the elite, and won on a populist campaign. So Peruvians were very angry at the elite. Fujimori was an outsider who campaigned bashing the elite. And lo and behold, he wins. He comes to office. He has no plan, no blueprint for authoritarianism. He had no idea what to do. But he got into office, and the elite, who he had been bashing for weeks, was very afraid of him. And so the media, the Congress, the courts, all the major players in the establishment began to hold him accountable, to push him, to really check his power. And so in the first few weeks, he's sort of a deer in headlights, and the media's screaming at him, and Congress is screaming at him, and the courts are ruling against him, and the Law Association is saying that he's unconstitutional, and he feels besieged by the establishment. And you get an escalating conflict between the president and this populist outsider president and an establishment, and within a year and a half, he called out the tanks and closed Congress and dissolved the Constitution, ruled Peru as a dictator for a decade.
Well, that's cheery.
You asked for the story.
But one of the things that you guys talk a lot about is the failure of what you call the guardrails of democracies. And this is a good place to look at how that fails in this particular case with the man in Peru, but in other cases as well, where an awful lot of what we expect in a democracy is not written down. It's the norms, and those norms erode very gradually until all of a sudden we wake up and they're gone. You want to take a stab at that, Daniel?
Let me just say one thing to set up, Daniel, which is that the difference between Peru and the United States is Peru had a democracy, but it was a pretty new and weak one. It did not have the advantage of the established norms that Daniel's going to talk about in the United States. So it was very easy to smash through the guardrails in Peru.
Well, if we're going to throw it right to the United States, I want to move us back a little bit then, and we talk about guardrails. One of the important things I think that you people talk about in this book is that what we are looking at now is not a new phenomenon. It's been around for a long time. You pin it to Newt Gingrich, although I think you could probably take it back even earlier than that, at least to the 1960s. What has happened, and what do you mean by guardrails and things breaking down?
Yeah, so we talked about the gatekeepers. When the gatekeepers fail and somebody comes in the door and is elected to office who clearly is either indifferent or actually antagonistic to democratic norms, it's a frightening situation. But we normally think in the United States or in any older democracy or any system with an established constitution that the institutions will constrain this person, because that's why the institutions and the Constitution was designed the way that it was. The Constitution will constrain the demagogic ambitions of a president or a political leader, and that's exactly why we have our Constitution. But it turns out our Constitution, of course, is a very short document, and really what we discovered in writing this book is that the written rules on the page matter a great deal, but equally important perhaps are a set of unwritten rules that have undergirded our political system. So words that are not on the page but are what we call norms. That's what we call norms, unwritten rules. These are shared set of ideas among political leaders and politicians and citizens about what is the appropriate way to behave. And so we call these the soft guardrails of democracy. And we point out two, and so I'll just quickly mention these two. So there's two sets of norms that have existed in the United States for a long time. The first is the norm of mutual toleration, or the idea that you accept your political rival as a rival you may disagree with your rival, you may dislike your rival, but your rival has a right to run for office and to govern. And that you don't treat your rivals as enemies. That's the notion of mutual toleration. This is really critical, because if it's not on the page anywhere in the Constitution, but this is a norm that political leaders have held for a long time. The second norm is the norm that we call institutional forbearance. And this, again, is not nowhere in the Constitution, but the norm of institutional forbearance is the idea that you should self-consciously limit your exercise of power, limit your use of power, and it's an underutilization of power. So if you think about what a president can do under the Constitution, the president can pardon anybody he or she likes at any point for any reason. What about the Congress? The Congress can do anything. I mean, at some level, the Congress can block at any point a president's appointment to the Supreme Court, or not even hold hearings. This is not constitutionally required. The fact that these things don't happen all the time is due less to written rules and much more to these kind of unwritten rules and these norms. And so these are the things that have protected our democracy for a very long time.
Can I ask you a question about that right now? And that is that because when the founders wrote the Constitution, they had an expectation that the people who would be elected under that system would be invested in democracy? That is, the Congress could do anything, but it wouldn't. The president could do anything, but he wouldn't. And if, in fact, the president overstepped, the Congress would take their responsibility seriously and impeach that person. Is that fair to say?
Well, I would just say one thing. I mean, one thing, of course, is critical is that this system was written without the concept of political parties.
Right, of course.
And so
actually, walk us through that.
Yeah, do you want to talk about the 1790s?
Well,
Yeah, well, okay, well, I guess, critically, these institutions were incomplete. And I think part of the reason they were incomplete was that people couldn't really agree on all the details. That's part of it.
Okay, so
Yeah.
when they wrote the Constitution, they were dead set against the concept of political parties. They thought that would destroy the country, and they really don't rise until the 1790s, really, under Thomas Jefferson, which is why I've always loathed Thomas Jefferson, is because on the one hand, he'd go to Washington and say, oh, there's this terrible thing happening. People are making political parties. And then he'd leave the room and start the political party. But we don't, so when they wrote the thing, they never expected there to be political parties. And that's what destroyed the Electoral College system, is because once people were declaring by party, the Electoral College didn't work anymore. So the idea that all of this changed dramatically in the first decade, really, of the Constitution matters for where we are now. And we really have never addressed that.
Yeah, and so the political parties are nowhere in the Constitution is another way to put it. And so in the 1790s, as a result of this, when people disagreed, there was a sense that each side was an enemy. And so, the one side viewed, the Federalists, what became the Federalists, viewed Republicans as representatives of France, and the Republicans viewed the Federalists as essentially agents for Great Britain. And so without parties to mediate these conflicts, each side viewed each other as enemies, and this norm of mutual toleration that I talked about didn't exist. I mean, the U.S. was not born with the norm of mutual toleration in place, and it only developed gradually over time.
I just wondered if you were going to jump in before, and I wondered if you had something to contribute to that.
So in a sense, the opposite of forbearance is what we call constitutional hardball. Constitutional hardball is essentially using the letter of the law in a way that very self-consciously and seriously undermines the spirit of the law. So the idea of the president pardoning whomever she wants, that's legal, but it clearly violates the spirit of the law. impeaching the president because you've got a majority in Congress but you don't like her or him is another example of constitutional hardball. Packing the Supreme Court. It is entirely legal. If you don't like the ideological composition of the Supreme Court, if you don't like the ruling of the Supreme Court, if you have a majority in Congress, you pass a law and expand it to 9 and appoint 2 more of your allies, or expand it to 13. That is entirely legal. It violates established norms, so it's what we call constitutional hardball. Neither of us is an historian of American politics. Both of us were, I think, learned a lot going back and looking at the 1790s and seeing not only the near total absence of mutual toleration, the fact that the two parties looked at each other as traitors, as subversives, but engaged in pretty hardcore constitutional hardball. So the Federalists viewed the emerging Jeffersonian Republicans as traitors, as perhaps allies, subversive allies of revolutionary France trying to overthrow the government, and they passed the Sedition Act, which came pretty close to outlawing opposition. When Jefferson won the presidency in 1800, the Federalists basically stole a Supreme Court seat away from him. The Republicans won control of Congress. They took that Supreme Court seat back. Then they packed the court. Then they tried to impeach a Federalist Supreme Court justice. So our politics was an institutional mess in the 1790s. It took a while. It took until the next generation, after the founders, that we established the soft guardrails that we now point to.
And then, of course, they broke down in the
Then they
1850s
fell apart quickly, yes.
in a very similar kind of breakdown that led to what people at the time called, or immediately afterward called, that recent unpleasantness, which cost 600,000 lives and more than $5 billion. And we still seem sometimes to be mired in it. But I have a question for you guys on the concept of the guardrails. And this is not in your book, and I do want to get back to the book, but one of the things you don't mention about guardrails is a bureaucracy. That one of the things that guards democratic norms is the concept of a lot of people who don't care who's in power so long as they get to do their job and get a paycheck. And one of the things and they're kind of an anchor, really. And one of the things that has really fascinated me about this moment is the degree to which the Trump administration is decimating the bureaucracy, packing it in the places it's putting people with true believers, but that it's not really getting that much notice. They're just simply not filling positions, not doing anything. And is that something we should be worried about?
It is something we should be worried about. Elected authoritarians, systematically, invariably, take state institutions, government institutions, and transform them into weapons against the opposition. They take what are designed to be, or what we hope to be, neutral institutions, whether they're courts or the FBI or the Attorney General's office, the law, and use those institutions as weapons against the opposition. So a bureaucracy, as you very rightly point out, is at least designed to be a neutral buffer. And so authoritarians who want to control the state, who want to deploy the state against their rivals, invariably try to purge and to pack.
Okay, so let's walk through what happened in America. If we've got the general rules here that authoritarians rise in certain ways, and and when the gatekeepers fail, and how they tend to take power either by the fact they decided to take power to begin with, or they kind of get backed into it, like my boy there in Peru. What on earth happened in America, or might be happening in America?
You mean today?
Well, maybe I mean today, but you people identify the real culprit here as Newt Gingrich. So I would like you to walk us back at least until the 1990s, and possibly to the 1980s, and possibly to the 1970s, and possibly to the 1960s. And
Well, a couple of different things have been going on. I mean, there's a kind of an intersection of a couple of different forces. I mean, one thing that's happened is clearly the way that, as Steve mentioned, the way we select our presidents has changed after 1972, and so this made it much easier.
So you identify the destruction of the creation of the primary system as being central to what's happened to our political norms. Okay, well that's something we can fix.
Yeah.
What do you think, Steve?
I don't think we say that it's central to what's happening to our norms. All we argue is it makes it more likely that an authoritarian demagogue will be elected president.
Okay, so what happened? So why is Newt Gingrich such a crucial figure?
Well, so the second, so that's one thing. That's a kind of mechanical change that's taken place. But a second thing that's changed, and we think driving the norm erosion that we witness every day.
Driving the norm erosion.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So the thing that, so, with the stuff that we witness every day that you mentioned at the outset, or that we heard at the outset, our politics is increasingly unfamiliar, where each side regards the other side as an enemy. I mean, there's a poll we cite in the book. In 1960, there was a survey done where people were asked, how would you be angry if your child married somebody of the other political party? And 5% of Republicans and Democrats said they'd be upset about this. And this poll was done recently, and the number is 40 to 50%. So, this is a fundamental transformation in how each side views the other. So what's driving that? I mean, I think that's the question.
Real question, isn't
that's
it?
the real question. And so that dynamic that I just described is what we call polarization. And what's driving that, to a large degree, we argue, is something that really began in the 1990s. We date it in the 1990s with the rise of the Gingrich Republicans and the retaking of the Republican Congress, of Congress in 1994. And in many ways, there was a deeper set of dynamics at work, and the Republicans, and Newt Gingrich in particular, recognized a political opportunity. So it wasn't as if Newt Gingrich created this dynamic. He saw an opportunity, and he took advantage of it. And so in the early 1990s, or actually in the late 80s already, he was distributing tapes to potential Republican candidates for office and teaching people to speak in ways about the opposition as enemies, as people who didn't love the country, as people who didn't love the flag, and so on. And this was a kind of new rhetoric for American politics that contributed to polarization.
Newt Gingrich's House, when he went into power and became Speaker, actually made Rush Limbaugh an honorary member of their class.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah, that language is obviously very important, but and of course that speaks to the rise of talk radio, which comes in the middle of the 1980s after the destruction of the Fairness Doctrine with the FCC. But the one thing that jumped out at me about this and the whole where we are right now, and I would put it earlier than Gingrich, but let's pick on Gingrich here for a minute, because why not? But what jumped out at me about him is why? Why did these guys do that? This is American democracy. There used to be some level, I think, at which you trusted that even if you didn't like the guys on the other side, they weren't trying to destroy the country. And I feel like we no longer have that norm there. And why DeLay, Tom DeLay from Texas, and Newt Gingrich, and the classes after them that have come, Tom Cotton and Ted Cruz, and the people who seem hell-bent on actually destroying our democratic norms. What is driving them?
So there are a couple of things. I think Gingrich and DeLay and their generation saw an opportunity to recapture the House. So the Republican Party had been locked out of the House.
Well, for sure, but why did they want it?
Because politicians want power.
Just for power?
No, this is the first part of my two-part
Okay.
answer. First part of the simplest part of the story is these guys have been the Republicans had failed to wield power for a long time. They've been shut out of control of the Congress for a long time, and these guys
Wanted it back.
Developed an alternative strategy to win power. But I think the deeper issue, which is I think where you're pointing, is that, and Daniel alluded to this, that Gingrich was one of the first. He didn't create this. He sensed this underlying polarization. He sensed that there was a growing constituency in the Republican Party for this, that he and his brethren, it's mostly brothers, were going to be rewarded electorally and politically for this kind of anti-system extremist rhetoric. That there was a reaction within the Republican base, mostly white and Christian, heavily Southern, against the way politics and the way our society was evolving, that they could tap into. That extremist politics was going to sell.
It was going to sell, yes, and yet I guess where I was actually pushing you to go is to what end? And to what end, by the time Gingrich was rising to power, was the divergence in wealth in America had already taken off starting in 1981. And, you know, what is the role of money behind this language, behind pushing this polarization, behind getting people to get to the polls and vote for people who are passing legislation that's actively hurting them?
So we make the case in the book that, I mean, that certainly is critical. And I think that what you just identified intersects with another dynamic, which, you know, 1964, 1965, the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, immigration reform, transformed American politics, and you had a massive flux, you know, over the course of the 70s into the 80s, into the 90s of Southern Democrats into the Republican Party. You had African Americans predominantly now enfranchised, predominantly flocking to the Democratic Party. Immigration reform meant you had new generations of immigrants and their children who mostly ended up in the Democratic Party. And evangelical Christians who had been evenly split between the Republicans and Democrats, now predominantly in the Republican Party. So by the time you get to the by the time you get to the 1980s, you have two very different two different parties. Until this period, the parties had looked very similar. In fact, there was a ideological mix of parties. And so by the time you get to the 1980s, you have a Republican Party that's predominantly white and Christian, and a Democratic Party that's much more diverse. And so it made it. So this certainly contributed to the level of polarization. You have two fundamentally different parties with different kinds of constituencies. So the combination of that with slowed down economic growth, which came in the 70s and 80s, created a very fragile environment in which it was easy to carry out this kind of politics of backlash.
Well, but in this, what you just said suggests that the differences between the parties were organic, really. They were coming from the bottom up, and yet that doesn't speak to the fact that Gingrich was deliberately using certain kinds of language. You know, I think I'm suggesting that people in power, your gatekeepers, your leaders, deliberately split the country down the middle. And I'm suggesting that they did it in order to promote legislation that did exactly what it's done since 1981, which is to move all the money to the top. Go ahead.
Not entirely buying it.
What's that?
Not entirely buying that.
Well, you're the one who wrote the book, so go for it.
No, I mean, big money has a range of negative consequences on our democracy, some of which have to do with our book because it's helped to hollow out the political parties and prevent them. The hollowing out, in particular, the Republican Party has allowed big money, particularly in the last decade, less the early 80s, I think, than the 90s and 2000s, but particularly since 2010, to jump right in.
Citizens United, you refer.
Right,
yeah.
to jump right in and write the laws of our country. The Republican Party, in some sense, the Koch brothers have a greater say over the Republican Party agenda than Republican politicians do. So
but it was Newt Gingrich who hollowed out the congressional staff so that everything got written by lobbyists. That was quite deliberate.
Yep, he and delay, but I don't think that they could. That's not why Republicans are winning elections. And I haven't seen enough evidence to say that this is a conspiracy from above by big money to sort of create the "what's the matter with Kansas" dynamic. I think ultimately there was a reshaping of the party system, essentially from below, that has polarized and led to a reaction, particularly among white Christian Republicans, that politicians like Gingrich took a very effective advantage of. I'm not convinced that this is a conspiracy from above.
So I'm going to split the difference between the two of you here, because I think what really has gone on is that there has been a transformation of our electorate, and it's become ethnically much more diverse. This, combined with slowed economic growth, again, has created a very combustible situation. If you imagine a counterfactual world in which the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act had been passed in 1950 rather than in 1965, you would have had 25 years of basically uninterrupted economic growth, and our political system would look very different today.
So I have a couple more questions for you. The first, and what you're talking about, the change in the Republican Party and the fact that it now has become sort of white, Christian, and ethnic. One of the statistics I don't see very much, and I'm very curious about, is demographics. You know, the people who are tending to vote quite religiously Republican are old. And the young people are siding significantly with the Democrats. But the other piece that fascinates me is one that I've been watching since the very beginning, and that your own Theta Skocpol did a great study on about a month ago. The fact that so many of the Democrats who are being elected right now are actually being elected by activity from the bottom up, from middle-aged women, hi guys, who are not affiliated with parties, but they are simply trying to take back the system. What is that demographic effect going to have on this polarization of the parties that you recognize as being so crucial to the destruction of democracy?
Well, the first question is the short-term and a long-term effect. In the short term, older people vote with much greater frequency than younger people. So a party that's based on old people is, in the short run, going to do much better than a party.
But they got a real long-term problem.
They have a real long-term problem, which David Frum, a conservative Republican, argues that that's precisely why the Republicans, much more than the Democrats, are bending and breaking the rules, or are breaking the guardrails. It's an act of desperation of a party that knows that its long-term health is not good and is doing everything possible to hang on to power now. So in the long run, the demographics never, politics always intervenes. Things that we cannot anticipate always intervene. So we cannot say with certainty that the Democrats and Republicans are going to be in X place in 20 years. But yes, demographics favor the Democrats, for sure. With Theta Skocpol, this role, we're just beginning to understand the effects of Trump's election on American society and American politics. And what our colleague Theta Skocpol has discovered, going out into 4 different localities in the heartland, I think in Wisconsin, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, is that there's been a tremendous mobilization of middle-class, middle-aged, mostly white women. And they're getting into politics, and they're getting into electoral politics. So they're responding through elections, through our institutions, and we haven't seen the impact of it yet. We don't know. We know that there are many, many, many more female aspirants, candidates, than ever before. There's been a huge upsurge in female candidates, mostly overwhelming on the Democratic side. We don't know yet, because there hasn't been an election yet, what its impact is going to be.
Yeah, Theta puts it dramatically. She says women between the ages of 50 and 75 are going to save American democracy. That's how she puts it.
We're working on it.
I should say that when I was worried, I shouldn't say this. All right, I have to say that. Theta told me that was going to happen a week before the election too. She said those women were going to beat Trump.
Well, she was, yeah.
So we don't have much time left in my part of things, so there's something that I just have to ask, and there's other things that I would like to ask, but maybe some other people will get to them, and that is the obvious question. If we are at a point in America where we have to be seriously concerned about the erosion of democracy, the last great hope of Earth, as Lincoln called it, what can we do? Not what can, John McCain do, or Jeff Flake, or Michael Pence. What can those of us in this room do? Regular people.
Yeah, no, it's a difficult question, because there's many times we sort of feel like we're in crisis, and so. But I think one of the things that we really one thing we can do is hold our politicians to a kind of standard, and hold our elected officials to a standard where they behave in ways that reinforce our democratic norms. There's a great temptation if you're a supporter of the Democratic Party to think that Democratic politicians need to, and there's a book that's just come out on this, making the case that, what's the name of the book that
It's time to fight dirty.
Yes, right, in which the argument is that if Democrats are going to win, they need to fight like Republicans. And so what we think, looking around the world, at other countries around the world, that citizens have a very important role in holding their elected officials accountable to behave in ways not to break democratic norms. So to give you an example, if President Trump, if the Democrats retake the Senate, and President Trump gets the opportunity to nominate a Supreme Court justice, there's good reason to think that maybe Democrats could vote against that, but there's some people who argue that Democrats should do to President Trump what Republicans did to President Obama, which is not even hold hearings. If they're going to do that to us, we should do that back to them. And what we argue is that that's actually very destructive, and that if you look around the world, responding in kind leads to very bad places. And again, it's not to say people shouldn't fight hard for what they believe in, but we need to really, in our minds, all of us need to have in our minds a distinction between policy substance, the policy issues we care about passionately, and the institutions of democracy. We can disagree about policy substance, but we shouldn't have people questioning the institutions of democracy and whether or not we should even comply by them. And so we need to have these separate in our minds and make sure that our elected representatives do as well.
So we want everyone to be protecting democracy. I do have a question, though, that I didn't actually intend to touch, but that does speak to the issue of trying to protect, for example, President Trump's ability to nominate a Supreme Court justice. We do have the elephant in the room, which is Russia. And I do think that we are at a point in America that we have never been in before, in that we don't know what that is yet, but it does seem that we're in a very different place. How do we take into consideration the fact that there is now this tremendous cloud over this administration, and yet let it do things like appoint Supreme Court justices?
Yeah, so I think we really have to wait for the investigation to unfold and to find out what the results of the election are. I mean, there were people immediately after the election of Donald Trump saying that, impeachment proceedings should begin immediately. I mean, I think, Donald Trump, whatever one thinks of him, he was democratically elected, given our procedures that we have, and so one has to wait for the investigation to unfold and then to see what the results of that are. I mean, and I think at the end of the day, Russia, or any external actor doesn't disrupt our democracy unless we are already at each other's throats. I mean, they're in a way that's external countries can take advantage of internal weaknesses. And so there's already a level of fragility in the American political system, and that's only we can take care of that.
So I want to throw this now back to Steve here. What do you think regular people can do to protect American norms and democracy?
So the first one is most obvious: vote. As long as institutional channels are open to citizens have to begin by using those institutional channels. And the best way to stop the immediate problem, which is an authoritarian-leaning government and party, is to defeat it at the polls. And I've got a three-part answer to this, the best way to end polarization in this country, which is the problem is much deeper than Trump, and the problem of our polarization, the fact that 50% of Democrats and Republicans say the other party makes them afraid. The level of polarization that is leading our politicians to do incredibly reckless things to one another. That polarization must end for our democracy to be safe. And the best way to end that polarization is for the Republican Party to become a more diverse party, to be a party that expands beyond white Christians in a society that is much more diverse than that. As long as the Republican Party is an overwhelmingly white Christian party, it will be prone to extremist, basically white nationalist behavior. So, what will make the Republican Party change? In the medium to long run, the only thing that will compel the Republican Party to become a more diverse party is electoral defeat, a series of electoral spankings. So, vote and defeat the Republican Party as it is currently constituted. But the other thing that we can do to combat polarization is to find ways to make it easier for everybody to vote. It is, in and of itself, much more democratic to have a society in which, say, 90% of the adult population votes as opposed to 50, 55, 58%. But there's also evidence, increasingly, that the low levels of voting, the fact that it's difficult, cumbersome for people to vote, is increasing the polarization of our politics. Increasingly, in the last few decades, in both primaries and in general elections, it is the most committed, the most partisan, the most ideological of voters who vote, and those who don't care very much about politics stay home. The problem is democracy needs those people who don't care very much about politics, because if they were all to vote, it would have a depolarizing effect. It would lead to, for better or worse, and I think in some respects definitely better, to more moderate, more conciliatory governments. So if the current move in many states, not this one, to make it harder and harder for people, particularly lower income and minority voters, to register and to vote is not only inherently undemocratic, but probably contributing to polarization. So if you want to support a cause, support enfranchisement, support efforts, reforms that would make it easier for people to register and to vote.
And with that advice, it seems like a good time to turn things over to questions from the audience. What would you like to hear from these two gentlemen? There's lights in my eyes, but I'll do the best I can. There's a woman right back there. Do we have a mic?
Thank you for your presentation and discussion at this very important time in our nation's history. There's a C word that was missing in your discussion that I think is another elephant in the room, not necessarily a bozo, but something that very much, I believe, has affected, if not polluted, our body politic, and that is capitalism. My question is, how might we begin to revamp our capitalism in ways that support a self-governing republic, which was very much part of the founders' world, and indeed, as Heather Cox Richardson points out, very much a part of the founding of the Republican Party in terms of the dangers of oligarchy, the dangers of concentrated wealth, and so on. We're living at a moment when it seems like that piece is not being addressed, even as it is a fundamental reality that contributes to not just polarization, but the decline of a sense of hope and self-direction that affects how well we govern together.
Great question, capitalism. Can I throw it to Steve here, since...
Sure. I mean, it's not. We've always had a capitalist economy, and all established democracies in the world have been capitalist economies. So it's not capitalism per se, but rather, one, the type of capitalism, and two, what we do with it, how we regulate it. I'm not an expert in capitalism or political economy, and Daniel may want to jump in, but a couple of things. One, it's clear that the type of capitalism that we have been living under has been evolving dramatically over the last 50 years in all of the advanced industrialized countries, and that our governments, our parties, have not reacted to it. So that has led, one, to skyrocketing inequality, income inequality, which undoubtedly is contributing to both polarization and populism in the United States, because of our racial diversity, almost invariably has a sort of racist white nationalist flavor to it. There's not much good populism in the United States. So inequality, but also to stagnation, and for the first time, maybe ever, certainly in well over a century, to intergenerational stagnation, to the disappearance of intergenerational social mobility. We are at a point where for the first time, we have an entire generation who are growing up to be worse off than their parents. We have not, and our colleague Donnie Roderick places the blame, the political blame, across Europe and the United States on center-left parties. Because with Blair, with Clinton, beginning in the 1980s, the center-left essentially dropped the issue of redistribution, dropped the issue of really combating inequality, and has not been searching for solutions.
I just have to jump in there.
Okay.
You can't blame the center-left for the fact that it permitted the center-right to do all those things. That just seems like...
yeah.
Well, it's not my book, so
Okay.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, well, there's one thing I wanted to point out. There's this incredible figure that is a frightening figure. If you look at productivity gains from 1945 to 2016, it's basically a kind of straight line up. If you look at the average salary gains, it perfectly parallels this productivity gains until about 1981. And then it suddenly flatlines. And so that divergence that began in 1981 is the divergence that's frightening. And this speaks to the idea of, future generations feeling worse off, or, being worried that they may be worse off and having good reason. This divergence took place in Europe a little bit later, but this is, in fact, around among advanced democracies. So, on this question of who do we blame, I mean, one of the things is that, the center left certainly moved to the center during the late 1990s, but there was good reason for this in the sense that, had, Bill Clinton not become a new Democrat, who would have Democrats may have not been elected. You have to remember where the Democratic Party was, or the British Labour Party was in the early 1990s. They were losing. They were losing repeatedly. So they thought by moving to the center they were going to win electorally. And so I think there is plenty of blame to go around. And in many cases, this was a defensive posture that these parties took in response to the move of center-right parties, in particular in Britain and the United States.
Well, we don't have to relitigate the past, believe it or not, coming from a historian. But her question remains a good one. Yeah. What does one do about that going forward?
But I guess the other thing is, I mean, clearly there's a global transformation of capitalism that's taken place. Growth rates have slowed. I guess that's the point. The role of labor unions has been transformed. The decline of labor unions has also transformed. So one of the things that is interesting to think about is how can labor be reimagined, or how can labor organizations be reimagined? There's lots of people, colleagues at Harvard and the Kennedy School, who are thinking about how can labor unions revamp themselves in an era of kind of work that looks transformed? And so this requires political leadership. This requires new imagination. But certainly, another striking figure that I've seen, there are these studies that look at how voter turnout is affected by right to work laws. So work that essentially limit labor unions' ability to organize. And in states where there are limits on labor unions' ability to organize, you have lower voter turnout. So this certainly has direct political consequences.
Let me just finish my earlier thought, which is that the center left is going to have to take the lead in policy innovation. The problem isn't so much capitalism as regulating capitalism and adapting to capitalism. And I think that center left parties, whether it's the Democrats here or the Labour Party in Britain or the Social Democrats in Germany, are going to have to innovate seriously and think about new ways of enhancing incomes, of providing jobs, of retraining, of dealing with the 40 to 50% of our societies whose incomes have been stagnant and who see no future. I'm not a huge fan of either Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn, but I think their experimentation, the beginnings to experiment on sort of on the left wing of policy is, I think that's the immediate future for the center left.
Hi, I want to thank, first of all of you for stimulating our thinking and hopefully our action. And I really hope that as you go around and speak about your book, that you really spend more time talking about the action part, because that's what we need most. But I wanted to ask a question about, you were talking about the erosion of norms that hold together civility in our society. And, being a psychologist, I know that norms need structure in order to create them on such a large platform. And then Heather mentioned earlier the fairness doctrine. So I my brain just sort of started imagining if we could bring back some laws, some structures like the fairness doctrine, and do you think we ever could, number one? And if we could bring back some of those structures, what would they be, and would they help to reinstitute some civility in our society?
Please explain the fairness doctrine, too, before you answer.
So the fairness doctrine required that media give equal time to different opposing views, and I think it was in 1985 is when it was. 1986, which immediately preceded the blooming of Fox News. I mean, so in fact, this elimination of the fairness doctrine allowed for Fox News to flourish. And so, this is something we don't talk about in the book, but it's pretty simple and pretty straightforward. I mean, if you require equal balance of time on different sides of the political spectrum, it's hard for something like Fox News to exist. How one would do this in a social media environment certainly is a much more complex question. And more generally, I think thinking of ways, one of the kind of exciting things that we've come across in meeting with people and talking with people, and also our colleagues, are people who are thinking about ways of training children, young people in particular, but everybody, in how to absorb news in a new kind of environment. And so one story I like to tell is, and then my father, who grew up in Maine, we were talking about this before, he remembers in the 1940s being in his 5th grade class, there was required for several years of his education to be able to identify the hallmarks of propaganda, and all school children needed to be able to learn. And this was a program that was implemented at the state level, that was a program developed by psychologists and sociologists to help children to be able, and he could still recite these to me, 60, 70 years later. And so, this was eliminated by the time in the 1950s for a variety of reasons, but, and the hallmarks that he told me wouldn't particularly be apt for our age, but this is something that we need to think about, is how to train children and citizens to deal with this new kind of information environment, and people are actively working on this. I know there was actually a bill in the state of Massachusetts revamping civics education that I'm not sure where that's
Passed the
happened.
House and it's in front of the Senate.
Yeah, so that's a kind of exciting development, a kind of more active civics education. So this kind of thing, I think, is critical, and we need to reinvest in these kinds of, at some level, at a more basic level, we've taken democracy for granted. There's this sense that we can act as recklessly as we want, and our elected officials can act as recklessly as we want, and democracy will be just fine. But I think we've now all had this experience where we know that this is no longer the case, and we need to invest in protecting our democracy, and this is one critical way of doing this.
Just a note, the Fairness Doctrine also required that media could establish what they were arguing in fact. They had to be able to prove what they were saying.
And I guess I sounded a little too dismissive of it. I think by saying that we couldn't deal with social media. I think this certainly should be rethought. The dilemma that we face when we think about solutions, and the reason we sometimes kind of hem and haw on this, is because we identify the problem as being polarization. And so to address polarization, many of the great things that we can think of, it's difficult to imagine legislation being passed because of the polarization. So there's a kind of catch-22. And so what this suggests is that the one way out of this bind certainly is creative political leadership. It's also successful models at the state level that can potentially travel to other states. And so I think this kind of thing happening in the state of Massachusetts is really important.
How about this gentleman here?
Hello. We've used the word democracy, and Madison, anyway, was certainly very leery of democracy. Shays' rebellion scared him and scared Washington. We have many aspects of our Constitution that cut against democracy, like having a Senate and many other things. So when you use the term, are you using the term as it is structured in the Constitution, or do you have something else in mind?
Something else in mind. Let you finish your sentence.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
No, political scientists, look, very, very few politicians in the 18th century embraced democracy. They were terrified of democracy. Our founders were terrified of democracy. The world changed dramatically in the 19th century, such that the fears and goals of our founders were washed away with history. Many of the institutions that they designed remained intact, but they were adapted to the modern world. So democracy really is a modern democracy is a 19th and even to some extent early 20th century invention. Democracy doesn't really come to the West until the late 19th, early 20th century. One could argue it doesn't come to the United States until 1965. So it's a much more modern phenomena than what our founders were grappling with. Political scientists, almost all of us, define democracy fairly simply. It's a system in which governments are selected through free and fair elections with universal or broad adult suffrage, and in which citizens enjoy a wide range of civil liberties: freedom of association, of speech, free press, freedom of protest. So full suffrage, free elections, civil liberties. This is the way that political scientists have been defining democracy since at least World War II. That's how we're defining it. That's what we mean.
On that note, too, we see this again and again and again whenever you talk about democracy. Someone will say, well, we're not a democracy, we're a democratic republic. And nothing makes political historians angrier because that's the concept. Of course, that's true, but it's a political philosophy that takes in under a number of different forms. And it just never ceases to drive me nuts when I've written a 350-page book and someone says, well, we're not a democracy, we're a democratic republic. I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. My God, you're right. I never should have written the book.
The same thing angers political scientists.
Anyway, over here. This lady over here in the purple shirt, I think. I can't really see.
Hi, I'd actually like to go back to a couple of things you said, one of which was middle-aged white women will save democracy. I would like to point out that after Alabama, I think we should add middle-aged African-American women as well.
Yeah, that's not our argument. That's our colleagues' argument.
And you talked about voter suppression. We are coming up on the 100th anniversary of women getting suffrage. You keep referring to 65, but we really have to go back to way back then. And the 100th anniversary of the League of Women Voters that has been doing work on voter education and getting people out to vote for just as long. I am slightly familiar with the European, where a lot of the countries did not even have it until the post-war period, including the new movie that's out, Divine Order, which was about women getting in Switzerland in the 70s. I have very little information about Latin America. So in terms of what we can learn from that suffrage and your particular backgrounds in democracies in both of those places, could you please comment on that?
You're talking about female
women being
rights.
involved in politics.
Women being involved in politics and in the expansion to universal suffrage.
Yeah, Switzerland was very late, but Germany, Britain, and a lot of these around the same period, 1918, 1928, in Britain and Germany, and so
Italy was 1946,
yeah,
and so was France.
Right.
So
right. There's a bit of a. I mean, people often. Yeah, that's right. So some countries are later. Some countries came with full democratization. So Germany in 1918, Britain in 1918. Women above a certain age had the right to vote until 1928 in Britain. So certainly came later. I don't know about Latin America.
But the question is a very good one. Beginning in 1980, we saw the first gender split in American history, and now it is at an all-time high, 27 points the last I checked.
You mean women voting for Democrats and
yeah, because when they first started to vote, they voted with their husbands. What is this going to mean?
Yeah, we talk about kind of racial polarization as being the kind of race and as being one of the drivers of polarization. But I think one could also tell the story of the 2016 election as a story about gender in part. I mean, there's a sense in which there's a backlash. That wage growth for white men, and the fact that you have more women in the workforce and so on. Certainly, there's the sense that maybe white men are feeling displaced. I mean, this is a narrative that's out there, and so there's probably something certainly to that. I mean, these issues are linked. I'm not sure what else to say beyond that. Yeah.
The other thing I would say is that in Latin America, most of Latin America granted suffrage to women in the 40s and 50s, the aftermath of World War II. But this surge of female candidates that we're seeing in the United States, which I think is not only healthy but belated, is something we've already seen in other parts of the world. The United States has been slow to. I remember when I was in grad school in the early 1990s, there were 2 women in the Senate. 2 women in the Senate. Yeah, 2 women in the Senate. I mean, so. Latin American democracies have more women in their legislatures and more women in the presidency than the United States has, and I think in Europe the percentage of
Europe
women
as well. And this is, and this is again parties as gatekeepers. I mean, the reason there's more women in parliaments across Western Europe is that parties really put an emphasis on this, and then they're selecting a party list. They put women at the top of lists and have what they, we were always afraid to use the word quotas in the United States, but they'll very self-consciously say we have quotas because we know this is an important matter for democracy and also helps us win elections.
Actually, many Latin American democracies also have quotas to have at least 30% of each party list has to be women, but of course that's not something we do here.
One last question.
Thank you for the conversation this evening. there's a couple of things that we're concerned about in communities of color. I understand what you're saying about white Christians overwhelmingly in the Republican Party. People of color feel that the Democratic Party, as well as a lot of people in unions, feel that the Democratic Party have let them down. And there's this kind of saying that the Democrats only show up in communities of color every 4 years, generally during a presidential election. The question is, with the elimination of civics in our school system, so people don't understand how government and community works together, is there any way to reverse this trend within the Democratic Party so that they begin to embrace people of color in a way that's holistic, realistic, and sustainable?
It's a great question. I think this is unfortunately a debate that is to come. So a couple of things, and I want to hear what Daniel has to say as well. There is a disturbing pushback, within elements of the Democratic Party, within some progressive sectors, who argue who argue just the opposite of what you've argued, which is that the Democratic Party has gone too far towards identity politics and needs to go back and win the white working class. What does it mean in practice to go and win the white working class? It means taking steps, both symbolic and real, to abandon non-white constituencies in the Democratic Party, or to distance the Democratic Party even further from non-white constituencies, which we think is a terrible idea. What's the answer? I think, and you can tell me where I'm wrong, but I think one change that's been happening over the last few decades that's, I think, irreversible is the Democratic Party is being, at least in places, being taken over at the grassroots by the grassroots, by women, by communities of color. The answer is no longer to be in a situation where some white party leaders are appealing to constituencies or communities of color. The answer is for the party to be communities of color, for the people who control the local party branches, for the people who run the campaigns, for the people who are the candidates, to be a reflection of our very diverse society. I think the Democratic Party is doing a better job of that now than it was in the 1980s and 90s. Clearly, it's not doing a good enough job.
And on that note, I think that's a cheerful note to end on, which is nice. And I wanted to thank you, gentlemen, here for everything you contributed to this. And it would be a nice thing, I think, if we could finish the evening hearing again from Dr. Grant.
How about a round of applause for our panel here? So in listening to this wonderful conversation, I'd like to just thank Heather, Stephen, and Daniel for a very stimulating, and I think it's good when we leave a place with more questions than answers, because it keeps the conversation going. You know, in response to the last question that was raised and just listening to the issues, one of the things that we're hard at work here at the Institute is looking at how we bring communities together. And last week, we had a significant conference here, a meeting of women who were thinking about running for elected office, Republicans, Democrats, independents, women of color, you know, across, and it was really inspiring as people are finding their voices. So thinking about places that bring people together to look at what it takes, to talk about it, to share those stories. When I look at what happens here when we're bringing school groups in and they're discussing the issues of the day that are affecting the communities that we're living in, we have to think about ways of empowering the next generation. I spent the last 15 years as a college president and as a chancellor in higher education. This is my first spring not presiding over a commencement in 15 years, so I'm suffering a little bit. But having the opportunity to meet students who are coming through our college campuses and through our high schools and our middle schools, I am encouraged by that. I am inspired by that because they're paying attention and they're going to be that grassroots. They are going to be coming up through the ranks and saying enough, because they become then the reinforced guardrails of our democracy that you were talking about. And all of us in this room have a responsibility to help them with that. And in the state of Massachusetts, where we have leadership in the House and the Senate that are passing legislation to look at how we teach civics again in the classroom, and how we have organizations like this that help students role play and work with teachers, bringing back the lessons to the classroom. I remain hopeful. And when we have an evening like this where we gather and discuss and realize that, as I heard Stephen Breyer say here a few weeks ago, the experiment is still unfolding. And that's what we have to hang on to. But we have a lot of work to do, much to pay attention to, because the moment we start paying attention, things happen. So I thank you all for coming this evening. Please come back. How about a round of applause for our incredible authors and Heather. And thank you for making us think, because all of the things that are happening, people came through the front door, through the elected process. So it's up to all of us to make sure those processes stay strong and accountable and inclusive. A lot is at stake. Thank you very much.